Welcome everyone to my podcast, No Forks Given. My name is Neha and I have with me today Dr. Lizzie Collingham. Dr. Collingham is an independent historian who uses food to link the minutiae of daily life to broad sweeps of historical processes. She's completed her PhD on the British body in India in 1919 to 1947 at the University of Cambridge, taught history at the University of Warwick, and was a junior research fellow at Jesus College, Cambridge University, before becoming an independent historian. And I know you've written a lot of books. Lizzie, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
So you're joining us from Cambridge, England.
Yes.
So the focus of my podcast is to look at the, very complex and layered topic of identity, and then use a more delicious metaphor of food to discuss it, because identities aren't as simple, right, as they seem to be at the surface. And we tend to put labels, but there are so many layers to it when you start peeling. And you've done a fantastic job through so many of your books that when you follow the breadcrumbs, you start looking at how complicated the process of building that identity is. And also when you start looking into it, you start questioning things like authenticity and stuff like that. And it's been phenomenal for me. And the book that I've really been reading a lot and I've used for my notes for today's discussion is your book. I know you wrote it a while ago, called Curry. So I want to start with that. And I love that as a topic because looking the way that I do and I'm living in the West, I get people who are trying to be nice to me just tell me I love curry, and I feel like saying I love sandwich, because I know it's meant to be a compliment, but it reduces the food of India down to a flavor or a powder, right? So can you talk a little bit about introduce that concept a little bit to everyone on the podcast?
Funny thing about the word curry is that it isn't really Indian.
Yes.
In terms of meaning a dish that one might eat, it's not Indian. So basically, when the Portuguese arrived in South India in the 15th century, they looked at what the people surrounding them were eating and they said, "What's that?" And somehow or other, they must have picked up some Malayalam, or I'm not sure what language. Nobody even really knows which of the Indian languages there. The word karil or kari or something like that. And there's a lot of dispute. I spent a lot of time on weird internet sites where people were chatting about where this comes from. There doesn't seem to be any consensus where this comes from or what the word originally meant. However, kari or karil was what the Portuguese termed as a generic term for anything that they sloppy, really, that Indians ate. And the British then, when they came to India later and started to establish themselves there, they seem to have picked up the term from the Portuguese. And so whatever Indians ate, whatever the dish was, it was called curry. And that's how the word curry came into existence. And I think right up until the end of the British Raj, and later even, no self-respecting Indian person would say, "I'm going to go home and eat a curry." I mean, these days I find Indians in India telling me that they make curry and so on. But they've picked up the word from the British, not the British picking it up from the Indians, and if you see what I mean.
Right?
They're trying to be polite and tell me that they do eat what I think they eat.
Yeah. I'm in New York, and of course, America has had less of a relationship with India in terms of, colonial or even immigration started so much later. Indians haven't been here for that long. And so I think they're at that same stage where they're just starting to discover Indian food. But there's so much more to, there is no pan-Indian food either. Even Indians think of themselves in terms of, Punjabi, Gujarati, Goanese, and there's layers of, I'm a Portuguese Goan, there's Northeast, there's the South, and the food is very different too, right?
Yeah, and every region in India has its own distinctive style. But then what I find fascinating is in India, it's not just regions, it's types of people.
Yeah.
Groups.
Exactly, yeah.
They will say, but we make this particular dish differently from the people just down the road. We fenugreek and they use cinnamon or what have you. It's probably not a good comparison. But or we only fry the spices first. We don't add them to the sauce. So everywhere, each community in India, and there are so many, has its own distinctive way of cooking. So yes, the idea that there's a pan-Indian cuisine is a bit silly, but then it has developed. I mean, I guess the point is, as the Indian middle class developed, as the 20th century went on and people traveled or went to Delhi to work, and people, I mean, in India then started to use cookbooks, which is quite an unusual thing up until that point. Then you started to get people, and people would live next door to somebody from another region, experiment with their food. You do start to get this kind of sense of, yes, there is a kind of Indian repertoire. There is an Indian cuisine altogether, even among Indians. But yes, it's an extremely diverse, multifaceted way of eating. But then it is also quite distinctive, isn't it? You recognize Indian food. When you're given it somewhere else, you know, oh yeah,
Yeah, that this is Indian. No, it's from the subcontinent.
yes.
And that kind of takes me to that whole, the ident, even the definition of identity of what's Indian has evolved over time. When I came 20 years ago to New York, and I was, or anywhere in North America, Canada even, when I was craving Indian food, I was not expecting to get home food. But even when I did go to a restaurant, I was left, not satisfied. And it was almost blamed on, very often I was told, "Oh, the Bangladeshi chefs own these restaurants. It isn't authentic." But Bangladesh didn't exist till 1971, and they would have been India till 1947, and so it's more to do with I think the fact that the initial curry houses, and you've written about it, in the West were started by the Sylheti sailors who left the ships or deserted the ships, and they happened to come from what became Bangladesh later. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I think that continued for so long that's been the myth about Bangladeshi ownership of North Indian restaurants.
Yeah, I mean, there used to be, I can't remember the figure off the top of my head, but it was something like 80 to 90% of
Then,
Indian restaurants in Britain in the 90s were owned by Bangladeshis, mainly from Sylhet. I mean, the point was, Sylhet was a boating area. Men had jobs on boats. And then when the steamships were introduced into Calcutta, they got jobs on the steamships. And they, unfortunately, tended to specialize in a really unpleasant job, shoveling the coal into the fires, the furnace, keep the ships going. So Sylhetis were particularly likely to jump ship because it was such a horrible job. So when they got to New York or London, they might jump ship. And if they jumped ship, then they had to find some kind of work, look for work. And quite often in Britain, they would get jobs in restaurants, washing up and so on. And a lot of them ended up working in Britain at that time, there were 4 or 5 slightly fancier Indian restaurants run by people who had a connection to the Raj, and mainly run for people who had a connection to the Raj too. And so they could often get a job working there. That way they picked up what the menu was, which was a kind of British Indian curry menu to cater to the tastes of old India hands in Britain. And then they would go on, and during the war, Second World War that is, quite often they would buy up bombed out old fish and chip shops or run down little fish and chip shops, add curry sauce, so-called curry sauce, to the chip menu and so on, or set up little restaurants and so on. And that's how they get started. And then once they've established a restaurant, they get people over from Sylhet, relatives or people they knew, to come work there. They earn enough money to set up their own restaurant, and it becomes a kind of chain process by which Sylhetis dominate in the Indian restaurant market. And the food that they're serving is a kind of odd interpretation of Indian food. It's a kind of a British idea of what Mughal food was. So the fancy food, the kormas and so on, and a kind of idea of what British people ate in India. And so that's as you get this sort of set menu of a korma, a madras, a vindaloo, and so on. All the British curries, really, a dansak, they're served on the menus.
and that then got replicated, say, in other places like New York.
I think so. And I also think possibly, I mean, there were Sylhetis jumping ship in New York and so on, so setting up little restaurants. I mean, the The big wave of Indians to America tended not to set up restaurants. They tended to set up motels, weirdly, for
Okay.
some reason. And then eventually, over time, they started setting up restaurants. And I think, yes, I think they probably replicated what was by then thought of as an Indian restaurant in the West. And you get the same thing happening in Japan. People offer P&O had a service to Japan. People would jump ship, set up restaurants. They looked pretty much like the ones in Britain for a long time.
And so the British have had a lot to do with influencing Indian food, but it wasn't really the mainstream Indian food or the recipes that they were influencing. They just started their own or influenced a parallel sub-cuisine of Anglo-Indian food, isn't it? And dishes, maybe.
Well, it's difficult to trace
Yeah.
exactly what happened. But in the 18th century or early 19th, when the British first established themselves on the subcontinent, they often ate Indian food, and they would often have mistresses, so wives,
Yeah.
unofficially wives, who would cook for them, or they would have Indian cooks who would cook for them, and they loved Indian food. And so they would say, oh, dinner isn't a good dinner unless it's got bowls of curry and rice all along the table. So they really loved the food. And Indian cooks then, over time, will have adapted the recipes to suit British taste. The British particularly like coriander and ginger as a flavour combination. Or they wouldn't make it so rich because or so hot with chili. They were worried about their stomachs and so on. And over time, the recipes evolve to suit a British taste. And then also the British, when they went around, they had they looked at curry and they said, well, what's curry? And they said, it's fried onions. Then you put in the spices, you put in a spice mix, at which point the British then invent curry powder because it's a shortcut. You just invent a spice mix and you shove that in, put in some stock, some chicken, and hey presto, you've got a curry. And
Yeah.
wrote a poem where he describes making it just like that. And so then the British would look around the regional dishes and say, but in Madras it's hotter, in Kerala they use coconut milk, in Gujarat, I don't know, there's a sweet sour. And they took very, very basic ideas of the regional differences and then called each curry a Bengali curry or a Madras curry and so on. And you get an evolving repertoire of British interpretations of Indian food, which the British are Indian.
So that becomes a separate set of dishes and cuisines because Indians are stubbornly, they hold on to how they want to eat their food. Like, I think more than a lot of other cultures, I want to be bold enough to, say that because I feel like second, third generation on, they'll be holding on to at least the spices and how they're cooking. But a lot of the ingredients I've learned recently, and I was so surprised to find that even, the spice that we think of the most when you think of Indian food is the red chilies, right? And they came to India the Portuguese brought them from the Caribbean, and they didn't even reach North India. And I'm from North India till the middle 1800s, I think, right?
No.
Brought it by the Marathas. But that's true of so many ingredients: potatoes, cauliflower, tomatoes. Everything that I can think of when I think of an Indian recipe, the ingredients are so recent, to India.
Quite often, yeah. The point is the chilies, yes, they come in with the Portuguese. And the point is the chilies are very good because they replace long pepper, in effect.
Yeah,
Because
okay.
when you dry chilies, they keep much longer. Long pepper, the problem with long pepper was that it would go moldy if you dried it and tried to keep it. It wasn't good. So chilies are good because they have vitamin C and then takes off like crazy in the south, which really had very hot food. Then when the British were settled in India, they would, around their cantonments, the kind of British settlements that were entirely for the British people, the collector and the policeman and so on, all lived in these tiny little enclaves. And around those enclaves, market gardens grew up, selling them European-style vegetables, especially in the north. And so cauliflowers, beans, potatoes. Well, potatoes are introduced into India by Kirkpatrick in the south, who actually, India at that point is fairly war-torn, I think. And he has them carted over the mountains because he so wants potatoes and so on. So, yes, the British introduced all these kind of vegetables, but the Indians didn't change the way they cooked.
They just added ingredients to it, right?
Yeah, or, used them instead of different Indian native vegetables and so on.
And started replacing those. The fact that food is so core to an Indian identity is also why it has lasted so much over, I mean, with the diaspora, isn't it? I mean, half the population of Fiji is Indian. They're so, that they've been there long enough that, while you call them Indian, they've been there longer than they
Yeah,
remember. And
yeah,
yet they are asked to integrate because they're not eating what is seen as non-Indian food. That, which I find is another, and I've seen that even in Caribbean. I was living in Florida and we had a nanny for the kids who was from the Caribbean of Indian origin and very keen to make curries, which was just so different. But the core techniques and some of the
the
spices and all were still
flavor,
there.
the palate and so on. I know, I mean, I was in Fiji, a taxi driver who was Indo-Fijian gave me a letter and said, Fijian food, I wouldn't eat that.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I guess not wishing to be too rude about Fijian food, but it's a very bland.
Mm.
So it doesn't surprise me, it's sort of, what do they call it? Breadfruit and taro boiled with coconut milk poured on it and a bit of fish. It's not very spicy. So if spicy is what you're used to, or sophisticated flavor combinations, yes, you would definitely want to hold on. I mean, what's interesting about many of the, like Fiji and South Africa, Guyana, so that they take, that's an Indian diaspora due to indentured labor, and they're often given what they call rations.
Russians, yeah.
It was allocated to them, and then what they would be given were very basic spice mixes, or quite often British made curry powder. So you will find in Guyana, for example, that their Indo-Guyanese make curry with curry powder, something which I think
Yeah.
most people in India wouldn't want to do.
You wouldn't want, yeah.
No, but so it's a changes and it adapts, and Mauritius and so on. I always wish I'd been to Mauritius because apparently the food there is so it devolves its own special little kind of, like, it just becomes another region of that huge continent with all those different expressions of eating. And why do they stick so strongly to it? It's very marked, isn't it? I mean, I think, trying to think, the Chinese too. The Chinese
Yeah. That's true.
don't like to eat. I think it's because food in a way is really tied to identity, in that it's very backed up with caste and social position in India in a way that it isn't in other parts of the world. In China, people will ask you, have you eaten rice before you've eaten, all the time. It's just, food is central to the cultures, and I think so it's very hard to leave it behind. Because it's interesting, because you see quite a lot of diaspora, they will make their food from home at the weekend, but during they'll adapt. But Indians I know eat Indian food every day of the week.
They
It's
do,
hard to
yes.
yeah.
I think when I was growing up and there was this intermingling of different foods was a little less like, when you went out for a break, the Mughlai food wasn't something that was cooked at home. It was stuff you ate at restaurants or was served at parties because it's richer.
Mm.
And sometimes when you wanted to take a break, you went and had South Indian food, but you didn't really understand the breadth of South Indian food, like a term, and lumping everything together, the same as I resent someone lumping Indian together. For me, it was just dosas and idlis and sambar. And then it was only in the 90s that we were introduced in Delhi to Chettinad food, and we thought we had discovered another region. And I realize now and I went on a vacation to Kerala with my parents. I was 12 or 13, and we went all over Trivandrum and everywhere looking for one North Indian meal because my parents couldn't get through the day. And it was so bad. It was, that all-purpose flour that we call maida, which is Indians want whole wheat, and the bread must be made freshly right there and then. It was stretchy and the peas were tossed. But again and again, instead of just enjoying the dosa, they would keep looking for that North Indian food. Every day we went from one city to the other, and it was just so, it was like, it was so different. Whereas that isn't the case now. Everyone's growing up with, which is what, to your point about Pan-Asian food, the concept of what's becoming familiar. There's a set of foods that are becoming familiar, and they come from different parts of the country.
Yeah. I mean, your parents looking for the particular kind of flour in Kerala reminds me in the late 18th, early 19th century, there was Francis Buchanan was employed by the British East India Company to survey parts of Bengal and Bihar and so on. And so he got together this team, and then
Yeah.
they traveled through really slowly, saying, "Oh, this village grows that, the people there do this," and so on. Minute description as a means of sort of taking control of the land. They knew everything. But what he had all the time was, as they got further and further away from where they started, the more his team of Indians complained. They said, "Well, no, the rice tastes different here. It's still rice. Oh, no, we want this particular kind of millet, and they don't do it in this region." And they
Yeah.
were really homesick for what
Yeah.
he perceived as all the same food. So that kind of that that sense of exquisite taste that detects tiny differences, that notices textures and so on. That does seem to be a very Asian
Yeah. Yeah.
quality. The British, maybe just the British, have their taste buds have been so ruined by processed food by then, or the Americans too, that they can't distinguish such tiny differences and textures and so on. I don't know what it is, but it's definitely it's a quality that is very distinctive.
Maybe it's a part of the culture to discuss the details so much over your meal and spend some time saying, I think maybe next time we want to make it this way or that way. But if so many of these ingredients that we associate with Indian food having come, in the last 2, 3, 4 centuries, maybe, if you roll back further, like the Mughals have had a huge influence on North Indian food. But when they came, and again, when Babur came in the forts to India, he was homesick. And again, he associated his homesickness with food. He was missing the food of his land of Central Asia. He was missing the fruit, and he complained so much about what India food was like. So, I mean, the first time I've heard, but what was food like then? Because they've given so much to the Indian cuisine.
Well, it's difficult to say exactly, but I think
Yeah.
the point about food, the Persian, sort of Central Asian, placed rice, long-grained, very fine basmati style aromatic rice at the heart of the cuisine. That was really, really important. Yeah, but and melons, of course, didn't grow in India and so on, and apples and all those lovely fruits. But yeah, and Babur, I think, was disgusted by mangoes, wasn't he? How could anyone be disgusted by mangoes?
Good.
But
Yeah.
but but so I think it was less rice based. I think probably in northern India at that point it was millets that were stronger, and I think Indian food at that point was spicy as well. To Babur, it tasted spicy. Too much, cumin, coriander, too much of that sort of stuff. Ginger,
Yeah.
garlicky, cinnamony stuff.
Didn't like
He didn't
that.
like all that. Yeah. So that's why I think that made him feel so homesick, because it was very.
Sorry, so his grandson Akbar was unique in his diet among all the Muslim rulers, right? He was practicing he was being vegetarian, he gave up beef, and the biryani is supposed to have actually got created in his kitchens with the dum cooked kind of meat cooking techniques from Central Asia, the palau, the rice, the culture from Persia, and all the Indian spices. Yeah, yeah. So
In the spices. So yes, at that point, and I think Akbar, basically, we know that in his kitchens
yeah,
there were people, from cooks and chefs, coming in from all over, who each brought their own distinctive way of cooking, and that created a kind of a place where they could cross fertilize across, in the kitchens, in his palace, and so that's sort of but that's the point about Indian food. We also have a kind of, one shouldn't get a static idea that these regions or that everyone has their own way of eating, and they've been doing that since the beginning of time.
Exactly,
The
exactly.
amazing thing about Indian food is that it's flexible, it's adaptable, it can take things in. I mean, it somehow takes in vegetables like the European vegetables, or it takes in Babu and his rice and so on, and then it gives it a kind of the Portuguese and their chilies, and it gives it a distinctively Indian je ne sais quoi, I don't know what
Yeah.
it is, and then turns it and then integrates it and makes it part of that cuisine. So I think it's it's not static, it's forever changing anyway.
Just hearing you talk makes me also think about Hinduism. The term Hindu was applied to the people who lived on the other side of the Sindhu, the Indus River. And over time, they've co opted what must have been separate, maybe smaller religious practices. Because when I think of vegetarianism and the fact that Hindus weren't always vegetarian, and the vegetarianism that started to increase more and more. And
My sense is that it's very much about the rise of the Brahmins,
yeah,
and the rise of vegetarianism is a way of demonstrating elite status.
yeah,
Long time within, it goes back to a lot of Ayurvedic texts and so on, that meat is kind of it's fiery, it's hot,
it's
it's,
tamasic food, right? Yeah,
yeah, a ruler and so on. So basically, a Brahmin would, of course, not want to do that. They're clear-headed and intellectual and so on. So the idea of being vegetarian, it becomes a kind of, I mean, the whole complex of a Brahmin cannot take food that's been cooked or touched by somebody else and so on. It's a form of violence, isn't it, towards
yeah,
us?
yeah.
An extreme,
Piety and your it's tied to their piety or their role in society, which is
it's an
some sort of
extreme act of elitism, I
yeah,
think.
yeah,
That sort of, and that then becomes tied in, and it goes all the way through. I mean, still, I mean, I've read interesting studies about women in Bengal whose families who've adopted, meat-heavy Western diets. They're Brahmins, but the woman in the family maintains the purity of the family by still eating vegetarian food, and so on. So it's become so linked to an idea of purity that it's hard to shake off in a way. But I think it comes to it's about social status, is my impression. But I mean, I'm not expert on Brahmin.
yeah. And Kshatriyas, by that logic, the warriors, they need so meat was seen to have attributes of masculinity, aggression. And when you're talking about the Bengali Brahmins, it possibly started much later, because there's also this whole point of the British managed to subjugate the Indians because they were not eating meat or they weren't strong. I mean, even in the 80s when cricket matches happened, I remember the chatter about, we would do much better if our cricketers ate meat. Look, Pakistan has defeated us or England has defeated us, which is really, and now I just wonder if the diet has changed or the training or in the cricket team. But I literally remember those words,
Yeah,
somewhere I must have admired it.
that's a kind of yes. So what the point is that meat is also in the British culture. You'll get, in the 19th century, they associate meat as it's the quality of the animal, quite often the masculine animal of a hunter. It's an animal that you've hunted. It goes into you by eating it. And that's very much, and that makes you more aggressive. It's
Yeah.
much more aggressive food. And so they look at the British look at the Indian vegetarians and say, oh, they're an effeminate lot. They're they so it's that kind of and they live in hot, steamy climates that also make them soporific and lazy, and gives you torpor and so on. And so the British, when they're first settling in Bengal, are very worried that they don't know which to do. Should they adopt a vegetarian Bengali Brahmin diet because that would help them to survive in that climate, or will that then make them turn into effeminate, lazy Bengalis,
Yeah.
and so they've got to keep to the meat? And so there's a lot of worries and there's a lot of ambiguity about that. And that then gets picked up by the Bengali elite, that they think, well, I should eat meat because it gives me the fine, upstanding qualities of an Englishman. So that, when the people are playing cricket and so on, I think that's an old colonial debate that's lasted on.
Yeah, yeah.
And, I mean, even Gandhi at some point decides to eat
Yeah,
goat.
he tasted goat, yeah, but he couldn't
Yeah,
live with that. He
no.
had through the night, I think he felt guilty
Yes,
and gave that up.
feels very bad. Well, maybe I should eat meat. Maybe that would make me a better person. So I think it's and that's very powerful in Britain in the 18th century, the roast beef of Old England and all of that kind of stuff. Meat is such a powerfully symbolic food that that's where it clashes then with the very powerfully symbolic idea of not eating meat to demonstrate status in India. And so it becomes a kind of big fat muddle. Yeah, I don't think eating meat helps cricket players.
Yeah. So if you go all the way back then to the time where Indians did eat meat, I mean, it wasn't such a vegetarian society, let's say. I mean, there are examples even in the Mahabharata where there's a cow admonishing people for eating beef. So therefore, maybe there was some beef eating still, but there's guilt associated with it. But way back in the older scriptures, I believe, and I haven't read them myself, and therefore, I defer to you. Have you come across work where there was meat eating, including beef, happening, which just over time just reduced when everything associated with the cow started becoming, pure?
I know a lot of Indians who happily eat meat.
Yeah,
It's
yeah, yeah, yeah.
the beef thing. Although in Kerala, Hindus will eat beef.
Hindus will, and in Kashmir, Pandits eat meat, not beef.
Yeah.
And whereas in Islam, the practice of eating was a serious affair, which needed to titillate all your senses. It was also about serving, the smell, the presentation, the visual. So dining was a part of the experience that was promised to you even in Jannat and, in heaven. Whereas the Brahmins, the Hindu Brahmins were aspiring to piety. And I feel that broad structural difference in the food or cuisines is still there. You do associate more meat with the Muslim food even in India, and it could be any geography, and there is more vegetarian eating.
That's it's kind of fairly recent phenomenon, isn't it? Which is grown up with Hindu fundamentalism as well.
Okay.
That
Yeah.
is much, much more powerful, that thou will say Muslims are different from us because they eat meat and so on. I don't think that is a timeless
Okay.
kind of quality. And, I think many Hindus during the Raj, you'll find there'll be comments of I've read
Yeah.
that saying people that eat actually quite a lot of meat. It's only the elite who try to make a virtue of their vegetarianism. So I think it's kind of become a dangerous political tool in a way.
That
This kind of uh, idea that we Hindus don't eat meat, you Muslims do, and
got it.
it's associated with a virility and aggression and piety and purity. I think those are dangerous tools which are coming back. That's a kind of language which is re-emerging, but is not representing a kind of long historical state of affairs.
Yeah. But then there are the other religions as well. It's not just a two religion country either, and we often forget in that debate that there are Jains who won't eat very, what should I say, the ones that are very religious. I know Jains who eat egg and meat, etc. also, but they'll do it outside their homes. Very
Yes.
often they will not even eat any root vegetables. They
Root
won't eat
vegetables
anything that's
shouldn't even be red. So beetroot is a no-no, even though it's a
Yeah,
root.
I see. I wasn't aware of I know that garlic and onions and those root vegetables are seen as violent. Just pulling them out is that act of violence. So,
Yeah, no,
yeah.
it's yeah, exactly. But I don't know enough about Jainism to know where all coming from, but it's an
There's Buddhism and Sikhism. I think in Sikhism, meat is fine because it is the whole concept of Sikhism was built on defending and, always being ready with your sword, and they were defenders and so on.
the martial food. It fits nicely with you are, you're supposed to eat meat if you're that kind of grouping.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that again, you can't lump it all as one, and or even two. There are so many religions and communities that. And can you talk a little bit about the caste system a little bit, and how that also dictated what you ate? You've already touched upon it a little bit, and I was just thinking if we just formalize it. Yeah,
Not
yeah,
somebody to talk to you about the
yeah.
how the caste system worked, but basically you couldn't accept food that was kacha, that was soft, that had been cooked like rice from somebody of a lower caste. You could, and then foods that had been fried were a little bit safer and so on. So that
Mm,
you end up with people. Brahmins only employ Brahmin cooks, and um, who you can eat from, and whether you would eat in the same space together, and and it becomes an incredibly complex means of differentiating who you are within India. And what's interesting about it is that I think, I mean, you see it breaking down. I mean, I'm thinking of Kerala, the place I know about most, where that breaks down when when women of the Naya caste have to go out and work, then they don't want to eat with the other groupings who are eating. But then eventually they eat in the same room with them, but they won't accept their food from them. And then over time, once they become friends, they do accept food. So caste restrictions do break down, but it's a really it's a because food's so important to who you are, and I guess it is because it's part of who you are in terms of your caste identity. It's also really hard to break down. And I think that might be also one of the reasons why it stays with the diaspora, because food has become so integral to who you are as a person from South Asia. But what I think is interesting is when the British arrive with their kind of outcast. You don't want to eat with them. You don't even, I mean, I still had people who didn't really want to shake my hand, didn't want to even touch you. You're kind
Yeah.
dirty, and especially the early British East India people. I mean, it must have been really quite revolting. So I think, but what's interesting is that then the British introduced tea, and you can drink. Everybody of all castes can drink tea, and everybody of all castes can drink tea in the same space. So it breaks down caste. Or there's a chap who describes how his mother is very, she has separate plates for visitors and so on. But then when they get the shiny white ceramic plates from the Europeans, she doesn't mind sharing that with somebody who isn't of the same caste. They can eat off those plates because they wash clean so nicely. And so there's a kind of biscuits and sodas that the British introduced, these are all kind of seen as somehow outside the caste system, and therefore a means, a way of you can share them across caste. So I think that caste is such a complicated and difficult thing to talk about in a few minutes, but I think it's very interesting because it makes very rigid rules for eating. And of course, that's why for the longest time, India doesn't really have restaurants and so on, which of course it does.
Yes, makes sense. Yeah.
But nobody wants to go out and eat in a restaurant because you won't only want to eat food that's being cooked by someone who you know and trust and is of the right caste.
Yeah, and maybe a lot of these things that you're saying, which the British introduced, did not fit into the scriptures or Ayurveda because those products weren't there. They didn't know where to fit it. I mean,
Yes.
something like that. A very early book I read of Naipaul's, very early on. I mean, I grew up in India thinking of myself a certain way till I saw it from the eyes of someone from the diaspora looking back and explaining myself to me. And he just talks about this, and it just was such a moment of reckoning for me when he talks about the hierarchy and how, in the first few questions, Indians must quickly place people in the grid of like, and then they don't know what to do with foreigners, so they get a little foxed. And I think that's true of people, that's true of products, that's true of a lot of things where they're like, oh, this is from outside, I don't know where it fits into my Ayurvedic sort of sense of what I should do with it. But at the same time, when you talk about the complexity of the caste system, I feel like even in schools in India, we learned the caste system in schools, taught to us in the way the British understood it.
Yeah.
And so I just could never apply it. Like we would say, oh, there are 4 big main castes. There's Brahmins, there's Kshatriyas, there's Vaishyas. And I would look around me and I would just like, okay, so where are we? Because my family is a Jat, we're farmers. And I'm like, are you sure we're Kshatriya? I mean, maybe my parents know a little better and a better, but they also, I feel like that regional knowledge is stronger. They don't understand Bihar if they are from Rajasthan and then, all that. Yeah.
Interesting that you say that, because I've always thought, trying as a British person who has no instinctive understanding of the kingdom, that when you read about it, and of course the British tried to codify it very early on and solidify and pin it down, just as they sent Buchanan around to kind of say, yes, in this village they do this and those people live there and they grow that food. They did the same thing with caste. They tried to pin it down. They got Brahmin scholars to tell them, okay, what exactly is this system? Should we understand it? And so they kind of solidified it and made it rigid and made it a system. But whenever I've tried to understand it by reading about all this, I thought, but I can't understand. None of this that I'm reading makes any sense when you go out and
Yeah.
read about, talk to any Indians. So it's really interesting that you say that, because I've always assumed I just don't understand it. But yes, it's a very strong sense that there's within a region, there are groupings of people who do particular jobs or tasks, and then they belong to that group. And they also, that's translated then into the food, isn't it? So they do rice, they do their rice that way. This lot do their rice differently. These eat wheat, those don't. So I think it's this incredible tiny a patchwork made up of tiny details. And I think caste and food go together very strongly.
Yeah. So if you follow who eats what or who accepts food from who, you can figure out the hierarchy. I've also seen how certain castes that are seen by others as, say, a lower caste will always have some story about their downfall, some story about what some ancestor did at some stage.
Yes, and it brings them
Thousands
back.
of years ago, and that led to the downfall or whatever. So there's always some justification.
Well, I think it's very interesting, because if you talk to Guyanese, Indo Guyanese, they've always got, suddenly lots of the indentured labourers, once they arrived in Guyana, came from Brahmin roots.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
suddenly you can promote yourself. Or you come across, quite often, I'm thinking of Kerala again, that's where I've read about this sort of thing, that groups will then, and that's very interesting in India, because it was much more fluid in a particular period, that groups would then adjust their behavior and adopt the behavior of the caste above them or around them, the slightly superior caste, in order to make a claim to moving up in
Yeah.
terms of the hierarchy and so
Yeah.
on. I mean, I guess in a way it's a bit like the British class system, which is, you meet someone, which class or you think from the way they speak and the way they dress and so on. And I think India, it's a way of sorting people and assigning them a place. And then it's very interesting that you would often use food in order to adopting food habits in order to move up. I think another interesting thing about Kerala is that, because Kerala really, which gives you an insight into the caste system, is that there they had a Jewish community from way back and a Christian community. And yet they all kind of fitted in and communicated with each other and lived in comparative sort of peace. And it's partly because you'll find the Jewish community exaggerate, particularly their food rituals and so on. And the Christians too, they exaggerate what makes them Christian. And because you do that, then you can all respect each other and you say, but he's a very good Christian, or he's a very good Jew, and he's a very good Brahmin, or whatever. And so everybody holding on to their little set of rituals, which give them a sense of who they are, can coexist very happily together. I think that's very interesting, because it's a way of not leading to conflict, rather than, as you'd expect, leading to conflict between groups. Where you say, but he's a a Jew, I don't like him. But that's not how it works in that in that period in Kerala. So I think that's the more you exaggerate your identity, the more you can get along in a society. It's very interesting.
But the reverse may also be true, because in North America, when I just got married and came, one of the things that every Indian panicked about, that they shouldn't carry the smell of their food outside the home. There was this constantly open the windows if you're cooking Indian, or stop cooking it. It might get into my jacket. And it was this craziness that I when I came here, and the fact that every time something was being cooked, we had to go through so much, and there was so much care to make sure that nobody smells us, because again, there was this whole, this whole smell thing has become another. There was
Yeah,
some incident
I
recently about it.
didn't work so well in America because the Americans didn't have this sense of
Yeah.
being, holding on to particular rituals in order to demonstrate who they were. And so your rituals, your attachment to food made you different, I guess. Yeah, I mean, I get the same kind of, I've come across the same kind of level of racism in Britain, where people say, oh, I don't want to live next door to that
Yeah.
family. We lived next door to an enormous, I don't know, I think it was a huge house, and it was a kind of joint family that lived there. And of course, the smells that came from there were delicious. And other people say, oh, we don't like the smell of Indian food. And I say, oh, I'm hoping for an invite.
Yeah. And
Well, I mean, Indians still have a kind of, I was listening to a very interesting program where many wealthy Indians have a kind of kitchen for show and a kitchen where they cook the smelly stuff. And that's another one of the reasons that people think that maybe Indian food, which was incredibly fashionable in the Victorian period, and Victorians would say, oh, no dinner party is complete without curry,
yeah.
but it falls out of British menus in the early 20th century, right up until the 1950s, 1960s. And one of the reasons that's been put forward is that kitchens come out of the basement; they're no longer cooked by the servants, and if you cook curry, it'll be smelly, and people won't like it. It's true, Indian food is quite smelly,
Yeah.
messy
Yeah.
food to make, isn't it?
So the other one more thing I wanted to talk to you about was tea. We've talked about how resilient the whole Indian food, and the relationship is with Indians and their food. Um, and they've always taken ingredients and then made it their own in their Indian cuisine. But tea was such a long-standing, aggressive, very detailed marketing campaign by the British to teach Indians to have tea. And the only way eventually, and India has such a huge tea drinking tradition that I couldn't believe that it's just so recent. I mean, we'll go through 8 or 9 cups of tea, but it has to be made our way. So yeah, that's very interesting. And my husband grew up on the tea garden, so the way they have it is very different from the kind of tea I crave. And for me, it's a comfort thing.
Yeah, no, I think tea is fascinating. Although the Indians kind of develop their own ways, like you say.
Yes.
I have to drink it this way. My husband has to drink it that way. You've done exactly what Indians do to everything. They say,
Yes.
oh, no, this is how it should be, and this small specific area does it this way. And of course, the Indians invent chai with the
Yeah.
spice
Yeah.
milk and so on. That's not the British are very fed up with that. So what happens is, um, the East India Company is aware that its monopoly on tea is going to go, and it does in 1833. And so they look for ways to get tea from China to grow somewhere else, which they control, which is India. So they they send this guy in, he steals tea plants from the Chinese because they guard their tea. Anyway, he takes it to Assam and discovers actually there's tea already growing there anyway. Indeed, the Indians did at that point drink tea, but it was very much a small amount, a small thing that you would drink when you were poorly, when you had a cold or something like that.
Yeah.
So anyway, it takes them ages to get tea plantations started up. They recruit Chinese shoemakers and people like that from Calcutta to go up and work on the tea in the tea plantations in Assam. Of course, they don't know how to make tea either. So that's a bit of a disaster. So it takes them quite a while. But by the 1870s, they've really got tea starting to grow. And then they start this amazing, by which point they've lost the monopoly. And so really they needed to grow. In between 1870 to 1900s, they managed to switch British tea drinking habits from almost entirely Chinese with a tiny bit of Indian tea to almost entirely Indian tea with a tiny bit of Chinese tea. So in Britain, that works very well. But then they think, well, we've got this enormous market sitting on
Yeah.
our doorstep. So they have this incredible campaign. They get people with tea with an urn and teacups and tongs and sugar tongs and milk jugs to go from literally from house to house to house and show people how to make tea to try to, and they leave them a packet of tea and hope that'll get them going. Or they set up tea stalls on train stations, they set up tea stalls in towns and so on, trying to encourage Indians to drink tea. And that's where the chai gets invented. So some tea stall owners think, well, it'd be much nicer if we put a load of yummy cardamom and cinnamon in, boil it up,
Milk and sugar. Yeah.
milk,
Boil it a lot. Yeah.
and it turns into this lovely thick tea. Of course, that uses less black tea, so the British aren't very pleased because that's, you know, this is a marketing ploy, not a kind of taste thing. So anyway, the British don't approve of chai, but yes, that's how tea becomes absolutely integrated. Railway stations.
Railway stations, absolutely. When those earthenware, cups, which these days when I go home, I mean, if I'm in a train, I definitely want to have it in that and then smash it, which I think was also a trend because of you didn't have to reuse a cup, right? The whole caste
Exactly. That's
issue could be averted. But you
yeah.
don't see those as much, though I love that. I mean, I think it's such a also degradable,
Yeah.
it's very earth friendly and environment
Yeah, there
friendly.
used to be whole
Yeah.
stalls in Calcutta making those cups and so on. I don't know, I haven't been to Calcutta for a while. But yeah, I love that too, that you could go and have your cup. But yes, that's the caste thing. But so you wouldn't want to drink out of a cup that you didn't know what caste
Yeah.
was before you, but you were perfectly fine to drink it next to a person of a different caste. And I think that's one of the really interesting, and it's in Kerala in particular, that's really strong. You go and sit as a man and drink your tea with all kinds of people and read your newspaper. And that really starts to break down what in the South is an extremely virulent caste system.
Yeah, and so yeah, the tea did do a service, right? I think there's a whole study one can do about the impact of chai on the caste system, I would think, or which is
Yes,
breaking, what a lot of other things couldn't. And it was also around the time when you had these reformist movements also, a lot of them coming out of West Bengal, the whole Arya Samaj, Brahma Samaj revival and so on. So I think the timing was perfect as well. And my father-in-law worked for a tea company, was a chairman. My mother-in-law, I think, as a young bride, went there. So she has all these, stories. And even now, so when I got married, they would serve tea with the whole paraphernalia, the matching this, the matching that, and the, handle of the teapot, like the staff had to discern, right, they should be for a right-handed person to pour it. And I couldn't have the tea. Like it was just for me so watered down. And I just went through weeks without having tea. And then when I walked in once into the kitchen and I saw that whole ginger and like the whole thing being boiled, and my husband's nanny was making some, and I said, "Oh God, you got that tea? I want some." But yeah, but they still, my in-laws drink that. There's a whole ceremony around it, I would say, that they've retained, I think, thanks to the lifestyle on the tea gardens, and they appreciate it. It's also the highest grade of tea is used for that.
mm.
Whereas the low grain, I believe the bad tea is what's used for the kind that I have, which is
It's
boiled
kind of
and
the
sweetened.
sweepings from the floor that are used for
Yeah,
chai.
yeah, and it's associated with truck drivers who will stop at a spot and have a really hard cup, and so I'm always raising my hand up for the truck driver tea.
But builder's tea, really strong with the spoon standing up in it. But of course, the British, you always used to drink very, very sweet tea.
Yeah.
That was how you.
And there was also food and everything. I mean, even now, it's such a part of the British identity. You go to London, and one of the things you do as a tourist is go attend a tea service somewhere, right?
Anybody, it's very rare now that anybody British actually does that.
Does that. But it's become so associated with the British identity, just like in the book, The Biscuit, you've talked about that association. The British at some stage decided what the British identity stood for, at least in the imperial context. So in India too, that's when they stopped serving a lot of the Indian, or at least patronizing a lot of the Indian food there, the way, and they dressed up for the meal and they ate British food, even if it came in tin cans, etc. It was about asserting, imperialism.
Yeah, but change. Yeah, they reject Indian culture. When they first arrive in India, they want to rule in
Yeah.
called an Indian idiom. They want to be rulers who suit India, who rule it appropriately. But then over time, as utilitarianism comes in, imperialism, evangelicalism, women come into India and so on, British women come into India. And it becomes more and more that they want to demonstrate their right to rule. And also, in 1857, the crown takes over. And so, yes, you have to demonstrate that you're a fine, upstanding, decent Englishman. So you wear your black suit and your drink your tea, well, not then, and then eat your bony fish and your bottled peas and so on as a demonstration of your Britishness. It's just become, I don't think they particularly like the food that they're eating.
Yeah. But again, becomes a core to, even asserting your identity, how you eat, what you eat, and also how you eat, which, like the papa, for me too, I think it was the first time I realized the papa could be served before a meal was I think a British guy. And I was well in my 20s when he said, I heard him explaining to someone else about the food and said, oh, this is papadum. It is eaten with chutney before your meal. And I thought, no, we just crunch it with our food. But, I just let him, and that,
Papadums before the meal, that's a sort of Indian
was,
restaurant thing.
yeah,
Because
yeah.
they needed a starter, and Indians don't eat starter. It's like in the Rashtrapati Bhavan in the president's house in India. Even now, when they have a state banquet, when they show off Indian food and they serve beautiful Indian food to their foreign visitors, their guests, that's on, you get soup to start off with. Because Indians
Yeah.
how to start.
They don't put all the food out at once. Yeah, but it's been, and there's nothing wrong with it. It's just that it's interesting to observe those little things and why they stay. I mean, in fact, I'd like to linger over my meals bit by bit too, especially if you're hosting someone. It gives you a reason to hang around, move somewhere else for dessert and coffee. And that's also not a very Indian thing to say, oh, we'll retire to, I don't know, a different room for a coffee or dessert. But it seems to make sense. And just as I think the castes were, the caste system, there was food tied to different castes. Now I think it's a little bit of class.
Yeah.
It's like in the big cities, if we want to demonstrate that, oh, you don't, you've got, you eat sushi and you understand this and you understand that and you understand nuances of, so that is how it's more about class and who's got more exposure and travel and money and access to these things,
Yeah.
I suppose. And similarly, in the US, somebody had said to me when I moved here that when India as a country starts doing better on the international stage, you will find suddenly people taking more pride in owning their Indianness. And I feel like 2006, the concept of brick, which became bricks later, and then suddenly in the last, especially 5 to 6 years, I feel this cultural sort of resurgence, or at least I'm seeing it. There's more visibility. 20 years ago, the main television shows in the US, I could not see an Indian character. Maybe a doctor kind of at the back. In the back, you had the Big Bang Theory where you had this geeky, nerdy character whose parents were just trying to arrange a marriage for him all the time. And that was it. The stereotype and in one show. And now I suddenly see in the last 4 or 5 years, the characters are playing mainstream roles and stuff, but also on the food front, suddenly the Lexington restaurants have been replaced by ones that have made it to New York's top 100, James Beard Awards. For chefs, there's a Michelin star Indian restaurant, and they're very regional. First one was one called Dhamaka, which had a wait of 1,500 people every day to get in. It was not, and the chef I spoke to insisted on not putting a tandoor on the grounds. He said, I don't want to get tempted to make that meal that everyone expects. And then he says, people come to me and say, how innovative. And he's like, I'm not innovating. It is literally, Champaran mutton became his main,
it's good Indian.
And now suddenly I see Champaran mutton everywhere in Delhi. I'd never heard of it. Like there are these little shacks and I'm like, because it's from Bihar, but people are traveling back and forth. Yeah.
You get butter chicken in Delhi hotels. You get. I've even had chicken tikka masala offered to me in India, which I didn't eat. But I mean, I think America is just a few years behind Britain because that really starts to happen in Britain in the 90s when we get a different group of people migrating from the continent, stilettis who've jumped ship or people who've come to work in the textile industry and so on. But, doctors, opticians and so on, people from India. There's a whole group of people who had restaurants in India who then brought their restaurant chains over to Britain and so on. So then you got the same sort of thing, you got very much regional restaurants that serve authentic food and so on. So I think the same thing is happening in America, very much so at the moment. And it's about, over time you become part of the society and you integrate and, those faces appear on television. It's the same thing that happened in Germany when I first went to Germany with my husband in the 90s. There were no Turks on television. There are lots of Turkish people living in Germany, but now they're absolutely integrated into the society. It's really normal. They're on television. They're not tokened.
Yeah. And the other thing I'm seeing is that I find that a lot of these businesses around food and snack have been started by second generation Indians, which again, I mean, growing up must have been tough for them. They were trying to blend in. They didn't want to own that identity, or they wanted the food shouldn't smell. They were, all those are now owning that a little bit. And you can see that there are some unique flavors. The packaging is modern and American. And most of it is not made in India. It's made in California. Here I was seeing there was and they're not necessarily advertised as ethnic food. It's just interesting food, which is part of the New York landscape. So I went to a place called Fonte's, which is sandwiches, clearly Bombay sandwich, Parsi sandwich, this, that, and the other. And there are these chips, the black salt, which is the kala namak, which is a very Indian thing, things like that. And they're all made in California, made in Texas, which was interesting to me because I know some of the people who are the founders of those businesses, and they're all second generation.
And America, unfortunately, I haven't got it here. Second generation have then written a cookbook with their mother. So
Yeah.
so it's kind of the mother provides, the idea that what you do in India, and then they take it and adapt it for growing up in Britain or in America. And so I think that that's a very interesting phenomenon, that you're getting a different sort of fusion, not the kind of fusion that I experienced in an Indian restaurant once, which was an Indian take on haggis, which I have to say
Okay, yeah, that sounds.
wasn't truly successful. But as fusion food, but these things, even when I noticed some sort of take on, I didn't make it, but a take on baked beans, very British. But
Yeah, that I've seen many times. I've seen spices on like cumin powder and some chilies to spice it up. I've seen that with baked
and all,
beans quite a bit.
all kinds of dishes. So I think that, it's this is the next stage of Indian food, absorbing influences
Yeah.
and making it into its own.
And I've looked forward to this and really enjoyed this thoroughly, Lizzie. Thank you so much
It's a pleasure.
it was really a pleasure. Yeah, thank you again.
All right then. Bye.
Bye.